All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started as people continue signing on to the event. Thanks again to everyone for signing on, and to the Partnership for Economic Inclusion for putting on this event. I'm Sam Carter. I'm a senior advisor in the Office of the Chief Economist at the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID. Before we get started, I'm going to just go over a few housekeeping rules for today's session. We're really looking forward to hearing about the rich experience of our panelists and having an engaging and interactive session. So please go ahead and start introducing yourselves in the chat. And you can also use that throughout the session today to start asking your questions to the speakers. We also have simultaneous interpretation available to both French and Spanish. And so please click on the globe icon. It's in Zoom at the bottom of your screen to make sure that the language is set to your preferred channel, including if that language is English. Today, we're going to hear insights on economic inclusion programs for displaced populations from a diverse and really exciting panel. Each panelist will present for about 10 minutes, followed by one question, and then we'll open up for broader Q&A among the group. Again, please do post your questions in the chat box throughout the session, and feel free to share your own thoughts and resources. And again, make sure to use the simultaneous interpretation option by selecting your preferred language from the globe icon at the bottom of the screen. So I'm going to introduce our first panelist, Rita Larok, who's the Chief of Party of the Graduating to Resilience project implemented by the AVSI Foundation in Uganda. Rita, over to you to introduce yourself and this project.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be here today. Like Sam said, I manage the Graduating to Resilience activity in Rwanda, and I'm happy to participate in a conversation like this because clearly it's important to understand what the evidence looks like and what people can do to make programs more effective. All right, so I'll take you through very quick slides on some of the new evidence we've been collecting and how that's working for us. But just before we go there, I'll talk about the activity that is funded by USAID, BHA. Its goal is to graduate extremely poor refugee and Ugandan households in Kamwenge. It's typically referred to as a graduation program. In this context, it's also referred to as an economic inclusion type kind of program. It's been running for 7 years, and with 2 cohorts, we are ending in September. And it's a $36 million funded activity with refugees and host communities. It's implemented by AVSI in a consortium with Tricolab, American Institutes for Research, and also has been evaluated by Innovations for Poverty Action. And the graduation package that is delivered includes 7 different items: coaching, linkages, asset transfer, savings, skills, and consumption support. That over there is the map of Kamwenge, where we are implementing. And the little red dots are the refugees, while the blue dots are the Ugandans. That generally, the setting in the refugee setting in Uganda is that they live together with refugees. So you can see that they're close to each other. So let's go on to the next slide. Now, before we go to I think the bigger evidence that you might want to see in terms of programs, this is internally what our data is looking like. I talked about 2 cohorts. This data is for the last 2 cohorts, combining the last 6.5 years. And it's quite nice, actually, as you see. We are measuring self-efficacy, and it's as high as 100%. Social capital, self-efficacy for primary participants. So we are trying to understand whether they have hopes, plans, goals, and what they're thinking about for tomorrow. We also measure school attendance. So while we're not directly paying school fees, we're helping families become economically stronger, and as such, they're able to meet their children's school fees and school requirements. Same for healthcare. They're able to access healthcare when they need them. They live in an improved structure. Their savings are good. They have more than 2 months of saving, meaning if they experience an emergency, they will be able to deal with it. They have more than 1 source of income. That's important if you are extremely poor and you want to make sure you have a diversified source of income. They are reporting high earnings from the businesses that they started. They are connected to banks. they have a good consumption score, there is a dietary diversity, they're washing hands, making sure that their nutrition gains are not disturbed in any way, and they're treating their water prior to consumption. So the indicators internally are really nice. And just to say, a program like this delivered with a certain kind of fidelity will get you these kinds of results. So let's go over to the next slide. Now, more externally, because that was really internal, I talked about being evaluated by IPA. These findings are largely the midline findings. You might have already seen them before. But basically, what IPA was doing was comparing 3 treatment arms to understand which of the treatment arms would be scaled, which would be most cost effective. The main differences in the treatment arms were that in one of the arms we were doing group coaching, while in another one we were doing individual coaching. And then the other difference was the asset transfer. So one of the treatment arms didn't have an asset. And what IPA did was try to understand which of the 3 treatment arms had strong results, but could be scaled up in cohort 2. Now, overall, even before going into the treatment arms and the results, the findings were very positive for several outcomes. As you can see there, consumption, food security, subjective well-being. The findings were strong, significant in comparison to the control groups, as you see in that graphic. We had effects that were slightly better for hosts compared to refugees. We had, when they compared group and individual coaching, results were similar. There was a similar pattern in terms of effectiveness, even though the group coaching approach was 13% cheaper. Asset transfers were really important. So the treatment arm that didn't have the asset didn't perform as well as the ones that had the assets. So therefore, the conclusion was, do not play with the asset, let's say, if you had to take out something. And then there were spillovers, which is also interesting because it means even if you're targeting a certain group, you might be able to have spillovers beyond your current program. And then there was, so like I said, there was a cost efficiency with the arm that had group coaching, but was also promoting social connectedness. So in the end, what we did was scale. So this is evidence that's useful for you if you're thinking about designing a program like this. Don't touch the asset. Make sure that you use group coaching because you'll save some resources, but still get the results that you need to get. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So that's exactly what we scaled, and this is really what this slide shows. We made sure to keep coaching at group level, even if we integrated some individual touch points. We also made coaching more digital and more visual because we had a high literacy rate, but we also made sure participants had handheld materials that they could use for planning and they could connect better with the activity. Next slide. So we also had another collaboration. So this is also external, internal with Duke University. This report is not yet out, but we have some preliminary results that we think will be essential, especially if you're designing a program now. As we consider scale, we are also looking at this report very carefully. So this is one of those where we study the coach characteristics and try to understand if these characteristics have any influence on program outcomes. So what should you do with a coach? What shouldn't you do? What kind of skills should they have? What do the clients or participants think about the coach? And some of the interesting results that could be useful for scale up was that apparently there is no strong association between coach demographics and coaching characteristics. This means, for instance, you could hire a coach that is doesn't have a university degree, a master's. They just need to have basic education, they can read and write, and they're trainable. You don't need to have a coach that has 10 to 15 years of experience because once they're there, they will be able to catch up. But the interesting part also is that once the coach is good, because of certain characteristics, they are going to make a real difference in the lives of their clients. And this is, you can see the costing and the productivity and what that means. And then a coach's background, you could potentially hire coaches that are peers, but it doesn't necessarily hurt their ability to develop relationships. Meaning once you can train somebody, it should be fairly okay. It's, the last part about this that I would like to comment on is confidentiality. So both for participants and for the clients, the coach, we try to understand, Duke tried to understand which are the essential characteristics that we need to make sure a coach has. And for both of them, it was about having trust, having confidentiality. However, participants seem to want a coach to be more knowledgeable, more available, more patient, while a coach is thinking about being a role model, being humble. So this graphic here shows you that sometimes certain patterns are different for the expectations of participants might be different from the ones of the coach, although both of them think that being confidential and being trustworthy is critical. So if you had to hire a coach, find one that you can be able to help maintain confidentiality and one that can be trusted, then you will get results that you can be proud of. Next slide. And I think the next slide really talks to the activity learning around graduation criteria. We are very keen about designing graduation measurements that are responsive to your population and your context. There are many ways you could measure if somebody is ready to get out of a program. What we recommend, and I think what we have learned, is that the more scrutiny you put in, the more likely somebody is going to stick to their results. So what we call responsible graduation is to make sure you don't just exit someone 1 month, a quarter later, but rather to measure them consistently and see if they maintain their graduation status over time before you conclude that they are really graduates. At the same time, what we have also learned is that each context may present certain vulnerabilities or that are essential for you to include in the graduation criteria. So a refugee will, for example, define vulnerability or extreme poverty as not having a plastic sheeting on the roof. A host community household will say it's something else. So defining those differences and putting them in the graduation criteria is critical. But also we understood that there is a differing timeline between refugees and hosts in terms of progression towards graduation. And so when you're thinking about designing programs, think about the populations and think about how much time you need to give different people. In our experience, refugees and hosts eventually caught up around the 8th quarter. But before that, there was a big space between them as they were moving towards graduation. That's basically just a slide showing our last graduation rates, which are around 86%. Next. And I think just summarizing, concerned that the probably taken up enough space, but we did a follow-up of the participants that graduated in the first cohort and found that a majority of them, of the hosts especially, 72% of them, had still retained their graduation criteria. The graduation criteria asks questions that are also related to resilience. For example, are you planning for the future? Are you confident? Do you have social capital? Do you have relationships you can count on? So those kinds of questions. So despite facing shocks, about 72% of the host community that had graduated could still meet that threshold. The refugees, on the other hand, had 51%. When we tried to investigate to understand what had happened, we understood that the questions around WASH had not been passed, particularly because the situation, the context where they live, we started having new refugees coming, which affected the water access per capita, and therefore it meant they had to deprioritize the water aspect. You remember one of the questions was about washing hands or treating water, and that affected their graduation criteria. But otherwise, when we also looked at the data that is related to shocks, majority, 66% of the households experienced shocks, but the big shocks were around illnesses, injury, death, and some climate-related shocks. Interestingly, they work with their savings groups to be able to recover from shocks, as you can see here, and they also reduce meal sizes and a few other things. But largely, it's important to use savings groups because they tend to offer the buffer that you need when you're experiencing a shock. And I think that sort of as we just next conclude, I probably talked a bit about this in the beginning, so we could go to the next slide. One of the things we did was basically adjust timing from 30 months to 24 months, significantly reducing the cost, because what we noticed with the data was that there was a huge dropout in the last quarter of the 6 months of the first cohort. So in managing dropout, we were able to actually significantly reduce the costs by taking a 24-month period rather than 30 months. I wouldn't advise that you go straight to a 24-month period or 18-month period. I think it depends quite a bit on the context and understanding how it's going. So our current posting is about 1,000 from about 1,400, 1,500 because of this reduction in time. Next. And just the last slide here is to speak to the things that we've learned and that work. Targeting a household is important, not individuals. Using group coaching, as I spoke about that already, and the costing differences. Integrate digitalization, visuals, to make sure that your coaching and your approach works better. Diversify livelihoods as much as you can. Include livestock, crop. Make sure you provide the opportunity and training for participants that is wide. Plan for shocks, and if possible, even in your coaching curriculum, besides the savings, social networks, have some themes that directly cover how somebody is going to be able to deal with shocks and stresses as they come. But be aware that the system that is around the household is really important. So if you have a context where there is nothing to work with, no partnerships, no government, it's going to be very problematic. You need to have the structure around that provides you the support, because clearly a program like this wouldn't be able to directly meet all the needs. Our optimum timing is 18 to 24 months. It can be adjusted depending on the context, but I think clearly what we are saying is that economic inclusion programs work, and they can have a very significant impact on refugees and host communities, as you've seen in those results. The next slide is really just about what you could look out for in the future, which is a number of studies, but also a number of webinars that we are planning to hold. Thank you so much, and back to you, Sam.
Thanks so much, Rita, for the presentation and the really exciting summary of results, including a preview of some to come. So we're going to take one question now, and then we'll have plenty of time for more questions after the panel concludes. So please do keep dropping your questions in the chat. I'm going to ask a question that came from Isatu Sar. Rita, could you talk about the key considerations for designing inclusive financial services for refugee and host communities?
Yeah, financial services. So, of course, if you're working with economically excluded people, it means that there are already challenges from the time of start. And so one of the things that I think for us was important is to understand what is required to design a proper financial inclusion system. What's required on the other end, and what do we have and what don't we have? And depending on your context, it might vary. In our case, for instance, at the time we started a few years ago, the requirements that were needed for you to just connect a refugee to a financial service were totally different. You needed to have a certain attestation card, you need to have a certain registration, you needed to be in a group, you probably couldn't take a loan. So depending on the context, you need to understand what exactly are those requirements and be able to connect to them or reduce those kinds of barriers. I think the other thing is the digitization, let's say. Many of the records of usually excluded people are very paper-based. They get lost, they get torn, they're not well written. And so as you're considering connections to financial services, oftentimes they'll want to look at that whole history and the record, and there is barely anything. So one of the things you want to consider is to try to move whatever records or whatever things you have into something digital that can be recognized and can be retained. But at the same time, as you think about that, there is going to be a digital literacy issue. Because if you already have a literacy problem, people can't read, right? Then imagine the kind of digital challenges that you might have if you're moving a system from paper-based to record. So that's something else to think about. Maybe lastly, I would encourage, besides, of course, the language, the cultural diversities, I would really encourage that you co-design as much as possible with the financial inclusion service point or some product that works, whether it's interest, whether it's timing, so that it really works for both ends and there is a gain on either side. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Rita. I think we'll transition over to Marcus Holmlund now to share some thoughts on the implementation and evaluation of an economic inclusion program that was designed for refugee and host populations in Niger. Marcus is a research manager in the World Bank's Development Impact Evaluation Unit. Marcus, so over to you to introduce us to the program and the results.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. And thanks, Rita, for the fantastic presentation. Really interesting stuff. And it's really great to see everybody kind of introducing themselves and the discussion on chat. So happy to be able to have this conversation, with such an experienced group. It's really a privilege. So I'm grateful to be here. And I'm excited to present to you some early results from a rigorous impact evaluation of an economic inclusion program that targeted communities in Niger highly affected by forced displacement. And in making this presentation, I'm representing a partnership between the government of Niger, the World Bank, and research partners at Trinity College Dublin and the University of Milan. And we're also very grateful to some World Bank administered trust funds for financing this work, notably the Building the Evidence on Forced Displacement Trust Fund, as well as the Knowledge for Change program. Next slide, please. So the program that we study was implemented in a context with severe and multidimensional poverty. So in Niger, about 41% of the population live below the national poverty line. The country ranks last on the UNDP's Human Development Index. And it's also exposed to very high levels of fragility, including climate shocks and conflict. So the country holds a large number of internally displaced persons. And as highlighted in particular by the number of refugees, Niger, of course, is at the center of a very turbulent region where the trends overall are worsening. And so we're in this context where we have a general climate of insecurity, political instability, including a series of coups d'etats. And the last one in Niger was less than a year ago in July 2023. Next slide, please. So in this context, we study an economic inclusion program targeting both host community members and forcibly displaced populations under the Niger Refugees and Host Communities Support Project, or PARCA, which was supported by the World Bank. The economic inclusion package in this case includes life skills and financial literacy training, business training, and then a cash grant. The program does not, however, include some of the other types of interventions that we often see in economic inclusion programs, things such as coaching that Rita spoke about, savings group, and so on. The program was also geographically targeted. So households were selected based on poverty, not on their status as hosts or refugees or IDPs. And it was implemented in some of the regions in Niger that are most exposed to conflict events. Next slide, please. Just to highlight that, at baseline, before the program started, we have hosts and displaced populations that look very similar along many dimensions, including their vulnerability. And to highlight one such area, before this intervention, we observed similar levels of food insecurity across hosts and IDPs and refugees. So on the scale that we're using here, 9 indicates the most severe form of food insecurity. We see an average around 7 with similar levels across population groups and across regions. Next slide, please. Now, before turning to PARCA's impacts, I want to highlight results from the multi-country Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Economic Inclusion Study, which was presented at a previous PEI open house. And so this is work by our bank colleagues and many others. And it shows in quite a striking way that government-led economic inclusion programs can have very strong and sustained impacts. So Niger was one of the countries included in this 5-country study. And there, for example, we see women's off-farm business revenues increasing by 62 to 107%. We see impacts on household consumption that are larger than the costs of the program. And both of these results are actually measured 18 months post-program. So very, very high cost effectiveness. And what's striking in this setting is actually that a package that prioritizes the psychosocial component over the cash grant achieves similar impact at much lower cost. So this Sahel Adaptive Social Protection model was used as a basis for the PARCA package. And like the previous experience, we worked with the government to design a randomized control trial, an impact evaluation to rigorously test the impacts of the program. And so we're building on the previous work by extending the analysis to another government-owned economic inclusion program, which is implemented by NGOs, again, explicitly targeting both host and displaced communities. And so I'm going to focus today on the impacts of participation in the short run, about 3 months after cash grants were delivered. But I do want to highlight that this is ongoing work. So we're continuing to investigate how the program works differently for different population groups, to understand spillovers and so on. So when we go to the next slide, which we can do now, I would focus on the direction of the effects versus the sort of magnitudes. And so with this, excited to give you the first preview of our results. Overall, we see program participants experiencing better livelihoods in the short run. So household income increases by about 6%, seems to be driven by displaced households principally. And we have short-run consumption increases that are commensurate with this income increase. We see education expenditures increasing by about 14%. Think things like books or pens, uniforms, registration fees. And we also see a large decrease in displaced households with outstanding loans. Then we see evidence of improvements in investments in income generating activities. So an increase in profits from existing businesses, an increase in the ownership of poultry and of small livestock, and also an increase in the amount of land rented by displaced households. So taken together, I think these results show that households are using the package, the cash and the training, to satisfy immediate needs, to invest in human capital, and also to improve their income generating activities. Next slide, please. PARCA didn't include an explicit social cohesion objective, but still, of course, this is an important dimension to consider in such a fragile context. And not surprisingly, I think we find that impacts on social cohesion are complex and they're mixed. So we have an increased trust of displaced persons in community members as well as in leaders. But we also have a higher likelihood of disputes and disagreements. So we have a fairly large increase in reported discrimination and increases in land disputes that are reported by forcibly displaced participants. So I think that the summary here is that generalized trust increases already in the short run, but at the expense of increased tensions, especially around natural resources. And I think that though we do see that there is some evidence of increased tensions between the hosts and between forcibly displaced populations, these are occurring in an environment where such tensions are fairly low to begin with. So at baseline, we have less than 10% of households reporting disputes and disagreements. And so it may not be surprising that an injection of resources in these very poor, fragility exposed communities leads to some competition for scarce resources. And this is something to be considered in the design of future programs. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, our analysis is ongoing, but overall, I think PARCA is another case that demonstrates that economic inclusion programs are viable in forced displacement context, and it provides some insights for future programs and research. And so there's many things to consider. To be honest, we still have more questions than answers. So let me just put out a few things for consideration. So first, with regards to the design of the economic inclusion package, it's possible that additional components may deepen and may widen impacts. So for example, from other settings, we see that savings groups can be important. Rita talked about the importance of coaching. With regards to targeting, we should think about whether population targeting can complement the kind of geographic targeting that was used in PARCA, and whether we want to tailor the package accordingly. And finally, we need to think about the context, right? And the extent to which we balance the ease of implementation in hard to reach areas with more integrated, more tailored support, whether there are implementation modalities such as mobile delivery that work especially well in fragile contexts, and so on. And another thing that we're looking into as part of this analysis is whether and how the level of fragility in the community affects the impacts of the program. Next slide, please. So what's next for economic inclusion in the Sahel? So first, programs are being scaled to more than 400,000 households under adaptive social protection systems based on the consistent and strong results shown under the Adaptive Social Protection Economic Inclusion Initiative. And together with PARCA, these results are informing new government-led programs, including one with the same name in Chad, where discussion around program design centers on things like promoting livelihoods diversification, the role of psychosocial components, mixed group activities to build trust, and so on. And then globally, on the research side, we have the PEI Impact Collaborative, and this is a multi-country, multi-partner initiative to build the evidence on the next generation of government-led economic inclusion programs, investigating questions like cost effectiveness at scale, optimizing program bundles and delivery modes, and then tailoring programs for specific populations and specific contexts. So in this Impact Collaborative, we're working through in-depth country engagements similar to the one that I've just described, and also through global engagements to connect an expanded group of implementation, of policy, and of research partners. And I want to conclude by saying that work such as this is only possible because our partners in government and elsewhere have the willingness and I think the humility to ask important questions about how their program works. And so, to our partners, to everyone out there that's contributing to understanding how we can make these and other programs really the best versions of themselves. Thank you. Back to you, Sam.
Thanks so much, Marcus. I think really exciting results. And again, we're privileged to be able to see the preliminary results before they're available online. I think I will go ahead and just speak for the group in saying I'm sure we were all intrigued by the social cohesion results. And so building on a question that Isatu had put in the chat earlier, do you have any hypotheses about how these results are likely to evolve over time as the program continues to operate and we get further into the analysis, as well as what changes to program design could make a difference here in terms of reducing conflict or perceived discrimination?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sam, for the question. That's it's very, very difficult to say at this point in time how these things will evolve. And I think one thing that we need to do is to unpack a little bit how the results in other dimensions are looking. So the differences in outcomes for the forcibly displaced versus hosts. And for example, and how these relate also to some of the kind of community level contextual factors, as well as to some of the baseline data that we have. I think, I do want to say that as far as these kind of mixed results go, and I did mention that there was an increase in perceived discrimination. I did mention that there was an increase in dispute around some economic kind of natural resources in particular. We also, don't see evidence of maybe other kind of more serious forms of conflict necessarily. So it's important to take, to put that into context. And I think it's also, important to weigh these against any benefits that we see, both in terms of the increased generalized trust as well as the economic outcomes that we do see kind of moving in the direction that we would hope. So, while I think it's important to acknowledge this and to think about the extent to which we can alleviate these things through program design, perhaps through incorporating specific elements that might address conflict resolution in the community or conflict dynamics in communities. I think it's perhaps not that surprising that, again, injecting this kind of relatively large volume of resources into very poor communities generates some frictions in the long term. These are fairly homogeneous. I think the kind of forcibly displaced populations and the host community members you know, share similar cultures, similar ethnicities, and so on. So one might think that these kind of frictions are a little bit more short-term, or one might hope that the frictions are a little bit more short-term and that they would evolve and kind of lessen over time, but it's not something that we can speak directly to. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and I appreciate you entertaining a difficult question. Okay, so we're gonna move ahead. We've got some great questions coming in the chat, but I want to make sure we can kind of let all of our panelists respond to them as a group. So for now, I'm going to introduce our discussant, Lena Astrom, from UNHCR's a Senior Livelihoods and Economic Inclusion Officer at UNHCR. So Lena will comment on the presentations and offer her own perspective, and then continue putting in your questions and thoughts in the chat as we hear from her. Thank you. Lena, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm extremely excited. I've been engaged in the graduation approach for a long time. Much thanks to a lot of people in this room. So, and also thank you for presenting and showcasing these two very different cases. And I think that makes a really, really interesting discussion and a lot of different learning that I would really like to see how we can continue collaborating on, because I have so many notes that I have to try to get everything together. Specifically, the two cases of the different outcomes, and from one very particular government program versus a program that was not government oriented. One very large scale without consumption support, and Uganda where we see some interesting learning on the importance of assets, the importance of the length of the program, and also the flexibility around the coaching component, etc. So these are really, really interesting learnings for, I think, for the larger group who are doing graduation. So thank you so much for sharing that. And although in Niger, it's shorter term, so the impacts are a little bit lower at this stage, but yet there are still very important impacts in both programs. So this is very much in line with what we're seeing, specifically in our own impact evaluation in Mozambique, where we saw very, very similar findings, maybe a little bit different from Marcus in Niger on the social cohesion. We saw quite important improvements in social cohesion as well as in income. However, also very fragile to shocks. There was a cyclone very shortly after graduation, and a lot of the social cohesion improvements were affected quite quickly, and then the challenges of resources and how this is split, and the willingness to share and the trust. So we saw that the vulnerability is quite high, even though there are great impacts. So with this, a lot of questions comes to my mind, and you know, there's a lot of research on the graduation generally, but less so maybe on refugees and displaced populations specifically. So one big question I have is what are the specific considerations that we have to make when we are doing the graduation approach for refugees versus other populations? And maybe a question to Marcus, from your learning, I was wondering about, you know, you didn't have any consumption support in your program, but you are still able to include it into a government program. What can we learn from that? We are really interested in inclusion. We often see that the graduation approach programs have, for example, higher consumption support and therefore very difficult to ensure inclusion into government programs. Could you see a few words on how you were able to do that, and how other people, what learning we can have from the inclusion aspects in government programs?
I can go before you, Marcus.
Please.
So I did find your presentation really interesting as well, and maybe just make a comment. I was looking forward to it earlier on, and I think maybe just to share something around the cohesion thing, and to turn to the question very quickly. I think for us, what really helped, because when you have, so while Uganda has this very progressive refugee policy that allows Ugandans and refugees to live fairly close together, and it allows integration, you still have certain challenges that you might experience, especially when you think about the services, the provision, the access, certain access-related aspects. Now, we have a policy that recommends you work 70% with refugees, but you also support the host community 30%. One of the things that BHA helped us do was to do a 50-50%. That meant the targeting was directly equal. Now, this was once in a while, it hadn't happened. And so immediately we did that, and they realized, the host community realized we were doing exactly the same thing with them as we're doing with refugees. It just struck up the cohesion. They started getting together better. They started offering land, because refugees have challenges with land, offering land for hire, offering land, offering opportunities to do some work together and sharing. And there was a better relationship, because they realized that, oh, these guys are actually doing the same thing with both of us, and they could appreciate. I think that particular thing really helped us a bit, but I think also related to one of the questions I saw on the chat, I think economic inclusion programs offer especially where you have assets and businesses starting, it means that there's a population that has cash assets that can attract others, employ. There's a thing with the market that changes, that automatically makes the neighbors or whoever else is not participating actually benefit in some way. And I think given that we had 2 cohorts, it meant that people were anticipating to get on to the next cohort, and it helped quite a bit because they could see, admire, and look, and they were interested in what was coming. I think just to comment on the social cohesion thing, if you're thinking about programming for refugees versus host slightly differently, so one of the things you'll notice is that host communities tend to be a little bit similar to refugees. They might have certain advantages that refugees don't have, but oftentimes the indicators for food security, the GBV will be quite similar, because they tend to integrate, especially I think in Uganda. And so when you're thinking about starting off, you are almost starting at around the same place. But the truth is, like I said, the timing for refugees was a bit longer, because I said there are certain disadvantages. One of them is land. So a host community has vast land over to them. The refugee community has a 30 by 30 meters, so you already have limitations. So to do a bit more, it means that you need to access land or talk to somebody or hire. Sometimes it's cheaper, sometimes it's not, but it can be problematic. So your progress will not be exactly the same. So in terms of timing, think about a bit more timing, a bit more opportunities. If you're thinking about cohesion, I think that's one of the other big things that we found, and it also emerges in the coaching study, is around the connection from one refugee to another. So you come in from a new setting and you're just placed here and you don't know your neighbor very well. Maybe you were not even very happy with them while you were back there, but all of a sudden you're now neighbors, not really relatives. And so you have to start connecting with each other. The host community starts off much better. They have relatives, they have friends, they can go and talk to who. And so even when you're thinking about the grouping, the VSLA, they start off very quickly and they look much better. You're going to have to do a bit more with getting the connections and relationships on the refugee side. And so I think what helps quite a bit is finding a coach or a community-based trainer that comes directly from there, that speaks the language, that can connect with them and help them make that movement as fast as you can. And then maybe just one other last thing, of course, besides making sure you have enough time, making sure you have the resources. I think generally the access, even if you have a progressive policy, if you start thinking about registration for mobile money, it might just be a little bit harder for you to have the paperwork, everything to get ready to go, versus if you're a Ugandan. So I think those kinds of barriers, you need to explore them carefully and understand how limiting they might be as you think about the design. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you so much for that. Maybe quickly before you, a quick answer from you, Marcus, on inclusion, specifically into government programs, but maybe also on scaling. You have such a large scale in the plan. Could you just say a few words on those 2 aspects? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I say half a word on another aspect, actually, also? linking back, Lina, to your comment on Mozambique and the improvements, both in economic outcomes and then in social cohesion, but also the kind of fragility of those outcomes. Thanks for bringing that in, and I find that very interesting. I think in our specific context, it may be that the levels of kind of inter-community cohesion were quite high to begin with, given that that you do have fairly homogeneous populations. But then there was a comment from Lene Hansen in the chat and said, is it possible the increased levels of tension reported as a result of increased empowerment? And we have been sort of also entertaining a little bit the hypothesis that perhaps these tensions are naturally going to arise when you introduce greater economic opportunities in a constrained environment. So, again, just calling for caution in interpreting those results one way or another. So the Niger case was part of a World Bank assisted project that sought to specifically provide support to parts of Niger that were very exposed to forced displacement. And the project actually did a series of things, and we focused specifically on the economic inclusion component, because that was, because of the strong results from the Sahel, and that was what the program team was most interested in understanding. So, I suppose that how we were able to kind of incorporate this into a government program that didn't have that basic consumption support, it's a little bit of a fortunate coincidence of how the program was conceived to begin with. But I think this speaks to something which, hopefully we'll be able to chat a little bit more about later on, and that's sort of what is the optimal bundle. So whether that consumption support element is an essential piece, and actually, what are the main constraints that need to be addressed in any specific context. Rita spoke to this a little bit in reference to the question on financial inclusion. And again, going back to the results from the earlier Sahel Adaptive Social Protection Economic Inclusion Program, the multi-country study, in Niger, there was a package that was tested that didn't include the sort of big cash grant, but did include more psychosocial interventions, and that was similarly effective, and of course much more cost effective, because the cash grant is a big element of the cost. And so, maybe we can see the consumption support as sort of another element of the package, if you will. I think that's something that we could maybe take away from the Niger experience. And really an important question moving forward is how do we kind of optimize that package? Over.
Thank you, Marcus. Sam, I have overstepped my time, so I'll just finish up with one quick comment. So I think, thank you so much. This is really interesting. And one big question also that remains that I think we can think of is, how do we link with other programs? There are a lot of other programs out there in market system development. And, when we are designing our program, obviously collaboration is always a challenge, but how are we able to link up with other initiatives that could support the interventions that we're working on? And I think that is also an interesting aspect to take away from this. So, but I'll stop there. Thank you so much. And over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Lina. And I will echo this question about linking with existing systems and services that are there. I'd be very interested to hear from the panelists. Just a few kind of thoughts that bubbled up through this discussion for me, and then I will actually ask you, Lina, a question first, so you're not off the stage yet. I want to highlight the fact that throughout the past maybe 10 minutes of discussion, we've really been talking about variations that happen at the context level and at the program level. So at the context level, we've talked about variations in the policy environment that dictate how displaced populations are able to access economic and other opportunities. They influence which communities are able to be targeted and where you can deliver support as an implementer and a funder. And Marcus highlighted in his presentation the kind of homogeneity among the host community members and the displaced community members as being an element of consideration when thinking about these social cohesion results. So I would just kind of encourage all of us to recognize, and I think we all do, but the fact that we're in an event talking about displacement affected contexts, but each context is going to vary quite a lot on these and many other dimensions. And so we want to be thinking about how we adapt these lessons to the particular contexts in which we're working. So if anyone would like to comment on that as they continue answering questions from others in the chat, I think we'd all really benefit from it. And then I will also just highlight, we've talked about programmatic variations, so including different components in the economic inclusion programs, taking different approaches to targeting, which will have implications for startup timelines and costs. And I would just echo the fact that these are really important questions, and I don't think there are kind of generalizable answers that we have as yet. So would encourage folks to continue sharing as you continue implementing. I know there's many people in the chat who are implementers and designing and thinking about these questions very carefully. Please do continue to share your thinking and any data on costs that you are able to. That really helps when implementers and funders are thinking about what these programs can look like, how many people can be reached by a particular version of an intervention in a particular context. So just thank you all for that, and please do continue sharing publicly as much as you can. So I'll hand over Lena with a question for you. Could you talk a little bit about UNHCR's broader strategies for refugees and host communities and where work on economic inclusion programs fits in, and any learning priorities in particular that you all have?
Thank you for that, Sam. We are just developing our new strategy 24 to 30 on livelihoods and economic inclusion. So it's a very timely question. Our priority is to facilitate, advocate, and convene in these type of programs. We are not always the best place to implement, and we are often the better place to coordinate, ensure that we have partnerships, ensure that we have the right legal framework and enabling environment, and also to ensure that we have the right partners on the ground and support from government to ensure inclusion in government and development programs, and also obviously in private sector initiatives. So this is very much our priority. Now, there will be many times where we have to implement because there are no other actors around or there are no other abilities. Some countries, they're challenging for other actors to operate in the areas where refugees are hosted. So in some countries, we implement ourselves. And in the graduation space, we are very much implementing together with the Poverty Alleviation Coalition, which is an amazing coalition of actors who are implementing and doing research and impact assessment on the graduation approach. So for us, economic inclusion is absolutely what we are asking for and looking for, instead of us setting up parallel systems. So that is our global approach on economic inclusion, to ensure that refugees have access to the same rights on par with nationals, access to the right to decent work and land and entrepreneurship opportunities. So I think maybe I can go on, but I don't want to take the whole time. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Lena. That's very exciting. And I know we're all excited to continue learning from UNHCR and the PAC as well. Okay, so moving into some of the questions that have come in from the chat. The first one is going to be for Rita, from Janet Hasey from PEI. How do you suggest that new programs design for flexibility and learning? What systems or strategies work well to enable those things?
Sure. I had actually tried to respond to them on the chat. I was trying to be very busy. But just to talk about that very quickly, I think that because Janet talked about lots of adaptations, yes, we did make many. Last week we had a webinar where we spoke about those adaptations, and I was out of breath just talking about them. And I promised that we would share a paper that summarizes all these adaptations. But I think in that webinar, we were speaking about just being able to track your context regularly and understand what's changing. be able to have a digital or adaptive system, a management system that gives you information and helps you make decisions. Have data on a dashboard that tells you so-and-so hasn't been reached. So this kind of information helps you to make the decisions very quickly. If you have a funding that's flexible, it's going to be very nice. Because then you can have a negotiation, you could decide to put certain resources somewhere else. We found that the theory of change approach was really critical because it would gives you a chance to reflect on each of the pathways and understand if they're really making sense or not. In the process, you drop certain activities, you proceed with others. I think analyzing your cost is critical. But one of the things that I really loved, I think, about my role here, and I'm really excited that it was designed in such a way, was to be able to breathe in between cohorts. So if you're lucky to have enough time to design a program where you can stop with one cohort and then scale, means that you have a chance at the beginning to understand the context very well, design it, do something as you learn very carefully, and use all the systems you can use to be able to learn. As soon as you finish the cohort, make sure you breathe in a bit. So study the context a little bit again, and then adapt moving forward. That's part of the reason why I think we're able to tell you so much about what we changed and what it looks like when we change that. So if you don't have that, then it means you need to be adaptive as you go along and be very fast to make sure that works. But it's possible, I think, with the kinds of tools that are available.
Great, thank you. And Marcus, any thoughts on this from your experience working, or Lena too, any thoughts from your experience working in other contexts with governments or other actors?
Lena, would you like to come in? If not, I'll.
Go ahead, Marcus.
Okay, thank you. No, I think actually, I mean, this is a really, really interesting point, and I wanted to echo what Rita was saying regarding if possible, bringing in that learning between cohorts and sort of, understanding what has and what has not worked in the program, and then kind of going back to study the context and adjusting accordingly. And that's actually, the approach, I think, when we talk about how should we design economic inclusion programs for context of forced displacement, which, as Lena mentioned, the evidence base here is relatively thin. I think this is exactly the approach that we should be taking, and the approach that we encourage our government partners to take as well. And so, that approach is one where, in the beginning, we say, look, we actually don't have the answers yet, right? But if we think about what the questions are, we can design our programs and we can implement our programs in such a way that that we can discover, we can learn about those answers as we go along, and we can make adjustments. So I think just echoing Rita's call for some flexibility, adaptability, and learning in the process, even in the context of an impact evaluation, is absolutely the way to go. And I also think that the idea of having good monitoring tools to capture implementation quality and actually understanding more about implementation quality is very, very important, and will be important to understanding the differences in impact, the differences in results that we see from settings, including the three that have been brought up here, right? Uganda, Madagascar, and Niger. And this is an active area of work for the PEI Impact Collaborative, where we're looking at, not only how do you measure implementation, but also how do you measure quality and so on. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Lena, any thoughts, or would you like us to move on to another question?
No, go on, please. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I think we've been talking about how to set up kind of a whole program or intervention, to have these adaptive systems and good monitoring in place. This is related to a question that came in from Savannah Smith. Could you provide any key advice or kind of steps, factors to consider during startup that go beyond this adaptation and ability to do so, to make sure that you're delivering an effective model if you're designing a new graduation program or economic inclusion program? Marcus, you are unmuted, so I will give you the
was-
right to answer first.
Wonderful. Sorry, I was writing the question. Apologies for the typing. The question was on the key advice, or the sort of advice on key factors to take into account at the beginning of the design process, beyond this idea of being
Yes.
adaptive. So I think in a forcibly displaced context, you're going to have perhaps additional constraints faced by populations that may not be present, at least not to the same extent, in areas that are otherwise similarly poor or vulnerable on multiple dimensions. And so I think beginning with, to the extent possible, having a very, very good understanding of who it is that your program is targeting, what are the specific constraints that your program is tackling, or what are the constraints that are most binding, let's say, and that the program needs to tackle, and how do these differ across groups, will be an important starting point. We've been thinking a lot about this, again, based on our results from Niger, and there is a little bit of a tension and a trade-off here, because, you know, our program in Niger picked a geographic targeting, right? It just said, we're going to areas that have a lot of forced displacement. And there was no further tailoring of the package to hosts or refugees or IDPs. From an implementation perspective, that may be a more efficient way to go, if you will. These are difficult places to deliver in the first place, and so introducing a lot of complexity into the program design may actually hamper your ability to deliver. At the same time, you may not be fully addressing the needs of your different groups, and you could imagine that, you know, persons, refugees or internally displaced, are exposed, for example, to higher levels of trauma. You know, they've lost social ties, they've lost assets, they've lost their livelihoods. So you might imagine that they have kind of a set of additional vulnerabilities that are deeper than the host populations. And so this leads us to thinking about, you know, what are the kind of optimal delivery strategies in the context, whether we can employ digital tools, as Rita mentioned in her presentation, whether we can have sort of group-based approaches versus individual ones that can make our implementation a little bit more efficient. I love the point on using essentially lay coaches, right? This idea that actually, you know, anyone can be a coach with the right training. And so maybe, you know, in summary, thinking carefully about the context, the population groups, the vulnerabilities they exhibit and how to address them, and then what are the implementation modalities that are going to be most successful given the context. So in finding that kind of optimal program, you know, we want to make sure that we're doing things that address the binding constraints, but for the sake of cost and for the sake of implementation, we also may want to be parsimonious in what we include. Over.
Great, thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Lena, please.
Yeah, no, I can also add a few maybe key factors. I think we have seen in some of our programs, when we are starting to discuss with the displaced population about initiatives that we are considering and their interest and willingness to join. And sometimes we find that for a variety of reasons, people are not interested in joining. And this could be, for example, because they think that it will affect resettlement opportunities. And in some locations, they will also targeted in some way if they join certain programs. So it's really, really important to think of the protection and other aspects around the program. This is an economic program, although it has other impacts as well, which might not come out very clearly in the beginning. So it's very important to do a lot of discussions and research around this before you start a program, I think. And this obviously will affect who you target and why. I do think it's really, really important to think about the long term from the beginning. I think we sometimes forget to think about exits and think about long-term strategies when we plan a program, and therefore we design programs that are very difficult to exit out of. We will not have funding forever. There will not be opportunities to continue this forever. So how do we think from the design phase, how we can hand over or how people can take it over, or what are the potential for long-term, where is this Where do we see ourselves in 5 years in this program? And then lastly, I think another very important aspect is obviously market and opportunities. We tend sometimes to set up a program because there are people there, and we think it's obviously important to have an initiative. However, if there are no markets, no jobs, no opportunities, the chances of success will, and then the fail will have much worse impact than what we, so it's, the access to opportunities is absolutely essential to consider long before we even think about a program, I think. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Rita, we've got a couple specific questions for you that are kind of building on some of the stuff we've talked about just now. So I'm going to go ahead and add one question. If you could talk a little bit more about the analysis you did on coaching characteristics and what mechanisms you saw in those results that could lead to kind of longer term outcomes and success.
Yes, so without spoiling the enthusiasm, because there's going to be a report in, I think around September, Dr. Eric Green will launch the report and we'll talk in detail about the coaching aspects and the characteristics. But so we just basically picked out what was emerging, and we were trying to, especially as help programs that are designing now and thinking about the future, to make sure they have these little nuggets to work with. One of those, of course, being that don't find an expensive coach, find one that knows many languages, find one that you can train, find one that, and it's many things that you need to find eventually. But in the end, we will share the report with the details. But overall, I think for us, the support structure that became available for the coaches, because one of the adaptations we had to make, for instance, was on the caseload. How many participants should a coach work with? If you have 5 days a week and you have to do group coaching and it takes this long, those kinds of discussions and decisions need to be thought about. Then it means maybe the maximum number of groups I can have is 4 for 4 days a week. So then the 5th day is really typically for the support structure, meaning I can have a meeting with a supervisor, I can share my difficulties. I think those kinds of things were caught by the researcher because they were able to understand that there was a lot of support provided, there was a lot of training, there was technical training, of course, but there was also the work to motivate, to encourage. The same way you expect the coach to be doing all this encouragement, all this motivation is the same way you want to have a supervisor or a support system that does something similar. And in a way, it sort of shows the need for a program that supports the coach so that the coach can support the family. And I think the other thing that they found is the connection between coaching and training, because many times so programs, in our case, we have a community-based trainer that helps with the VSLS setup, with the livelihood skills, but then at the same time, you have the coach that does all the reinforcement, the topics, the encouragement. The connection between these two people is critical. And I think the more they connected with each other because they were working with the same groups, the more they understood the population they were with. And then it also helped the participants see them as one entity that's providing support in different ways. I think I could add that, but look out for the final evaluation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rita. So I'm going to kind of build on this discussion of coaching to ask a question related to designing for scale. So these are relatively high touch, and I think we've gotten kind of two extremes in the examples we've talked about today in terms of high touch versus less high touch. High touch designs, but wanting to design for scale, design for contexts that are frequently affected by shocks, and contexts where, relatedly, the populations are relatively mobile. So how do we take these things into account when designing multi-component, relatively high-touch programs?
So I would say that digital, back to the story of digital and literacy. I did make a comment there about your context I think a big piece of the work of a design is really to understand the context as much as you can. And if you know that your context is mobile, it means that you will not be able to have a weekly touch point, or they will disappear for some 3 months and go into a fishing place or go to a farming place and then come back 3 months later. So then what do you do with that absence of 3 months? It means that you need to evolve your coaching or your support work to be able to reach them. Mm-hmm. Of course, nothing replaces the human, the person in front of another one. But in the case where you become aware that, for example, during COVID, you can't really go there physically, but you still want to be able to send messages. I think there are ways in which you could adapt technology, relationships. I'll give you a simple example. During the time we had to move to group coaching because it was cheaper, it was effective, we still felt that there was a need to have like an in-person thing at home. And so we integrated one touch point at home a quarter. But then we also decided that participants are connected to somebody else in the group who they call a buddy or a peer. And they are such good friends, they need to become good friends. In a way, we were forcing cohesion, even if the person, because we were randomly selecting you and tagging you to somebody else. So if you are missing from a coaching session, I would ask, oh, what happened? Why didn't the person come? And so we ended up creating additional coaches or additional trainers that would be supportive of others. So that's one way you could harness the power of the group. But then there are all these, if you do have, because I think for many populations, the access to devices is increasing. If you don't have them, maybe plan for some of that. And some basic digital literacy skills might help. Because a WhatsApp message, a small video on self-efficacy, market information that comes in a very timely way, really does provide the information that you wouldn't be able to provide if you weren't there physically. We noticed, for instance, that one of the things that challenged us, because we kept reporting, oh, the households are dropping out, we can't find them in certain cases. But the evaluator was finding everybody. And then we understood that the evaluator was finding them because they were actually calling them and looking for them wherever it is, even if they had shifted from the location. So it means in a fairly moving context, you need to figure out ways in which you move along to be able to still be present and supportive so that these outcomes, these gains can remain.
Thank you. Yeah, a great couple of examples there. Marcus, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Sam. Thanks, Rita. You know, how to design for scale in contexts affected by shocks and with mobile populations is like the $1 million question, right? So thanks for giving us an easy one, Sam. I think, you know, I like these two cases side by side are very nice, right? Because they are quite different in the approach, and we can see, I think, relative strengths and relative weaknesses of each one. So the program in Uganda, I think, was initially a 30-month program, right, and then scaled back to 24, if I remember correctly. So, you know, a 2-year program. In contrast, in the PARCA case in Niger, the program was delivered essentially over 2 weeks, right? You had some life skills and financial literacy training, and you had sort of a week of entrepreneurship and business training, and then you had a cash grant. So these really are two kind of two extremes of the approach. I think what we see from the PARCA case is that even with this relatively pared down intervention, you do see positive results across different population groups, and that may be particularly important in settings where people are mobile. And to Lina's point on the market, the opportunities out there, mobility may actually be a desirable outcome, right? It may be that you want people to move on to areas where there are greater economic opportunities. So I think thinking very much about how to maintain contact with the populations, with the mobile population, is probably something that we should be doing much more about. And Rita already spoke to this, right? The fact that we are more and more connected, we can not only keep in touch with mobile populations, but we can deliver services digitally. So we can deliver some information, we can deliver, some coaching, reminders, behavior change communication, and so on, without actually having to be physically present in the same location, or without participants having to be physically present in the same location. I think something that has been shown to work across a lot of settings is having sort of savings or self-help type groups set up as part of the program. And I think this again speaks to something that Rita mentioned, which is sort of having that buddy system, creating cohorts or small groups within communities that can support one another. Also as an element of sustainability, if indeed it is hard to physically reach them, and so on. But yeah, I really think that if we had this this answer, it'd be fantastic. It's something that we're actively working on, but I think studies such as the ones that we've discussed here give us some at least guiding directions that we can think about in creating kind of more efficient but also more effective programs for highly mobile populations. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to start wrapping us up as we get towards the end of our session today. I'll hand over once more to Lina to comment on this question of fragility and mobile populations. And I want to give a shout out to Sarah Ward, who had actually framed that question in the chat. So I can't take all the credit for the hard questions. So Lina, any thoughts you have on fragility and mobile populations? And then the closing question for all of you, so Marcus and Rita, if you could go ahead and start thinking about this, is could you just identify one or two open questions that you think are really important for this community to be learning about in the future? If you had to prioritize where we need new research on implementation or impact or something else, I'd love to make sure we can highlight that. But Lina, first, any thoughts on the context question?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, like Marcus was saying, I think sometimes mobility is an opportunity. In our operation in Mexico, refugees are being moved from the south, where there are very little opportunities, to the north, where there are lots of private sector opportunities, and have access to decent work opportunities there. So sometimes that is a great opportunity. Now, unfortunately, many populations are not mobile because they are not allowed to move, right? They are forced to stay in the place that they have been allocated, which we often see as a limitation. Freedom of movement is an absolute necessary aspect if you're going to achieve self-reliance and economic inclusion. So I think often we see that there is too little mobility. A lot of populations are protracted, and they're staying in the same place for a long time. They don't have the right to work in the capital city or other smaller cities, for example. So I would say that the lack of mobility is much of a challenge, more than maybe mobility in many of the operations or the countries where we are working with displaced populations.
Thank you, Lina. Oh, thanks, Lina. Rita, would you like to go ahead and start us off with any final thoughts on important areas for future learning?
Yes, sure. Because I think that so one of the things that's outstanding for economic inclusion programs is that they work. But then the thing is, and they work in multiple contexts. And there's always this conversation about adaptation, adapt this, change this context. So it sounds like they work, and there is like a rubric. There's 4, 5, 6, 7 components. If you use them, then it will lead to this. But many times it's about the how you finally get to deliver these aspects, and how you sequence them, and how adaptive your program is. Really, it somehow differs with context, and I think the new conversation, and probably it's a space that we are going to all build upon, is to understand what do you need to touch? Like, what are those specific things that you must look at? And I see that this is a question on the chat that you must look at as you're thinking about design in a new context. Yes, it's true that there's a lot of information about, collect information on gender, on youth, find out if there are systems, find out if there's this. But I'm hoping that in the next few months, eventually we shall arrive at something that says, okay, this looks like the good print. You need to do this, and that, so that you can be able to directly have a successful program. I would say, I think that's a curiosity of mine. We've started doing some work around frameworks for adaptation, context, and comparing different locations, so we can be able to say a bit more about that. But I'm hoping there is interest by other people to look there. But I think just to respond on one comment, because I noticed it kept coming about the refugees, why did they not stay resilient, the shocks, what do you do with shocks, what kinds of shocks did they face? I did say something about this at the start, and I would say it again. When you're thinking about a design or a scale, look at the systems that are in place. And the systems might be a functional market where you could have your participants participate. It could be a functional health system, a referral place where you can send people, you can send a malnourished child, or you can help deal with malaria. It could be as simple as that. It could even be just water access or a road network. So the more problematic those systems are, the more likely you're going to struggle. Because the truth is the shocks and stresses are going to continue. They will be there. And usually, the shocks and stresses can be dealt with by somehow those systems, but also your program will contribute. So you can do all you can, make sure people are connected, they have relationships, they have access to this. But once the system lets you down, then you're in trouble. So in a way, and I think that's what happened to us with that context. Because we were sure that they have made it, they have savings there. Even if they faced a shock and they were struggling for resources, they went back to their savings money and they were able to get back. But the fact that they were struggling with water, just water, because their access had reduced, meant that they had to start deprioritizing certain things and then prioritizing others. Then you could say that maybe typically we were measuring the wrong thing, just washing your hands or treating water. But for a nutrition program, if somebody didn't wash their hands continuously or didn't have treated water, it could get into something problematic. So again, the point on, even when you're designing your program, try to assess these systems well so you can plan for them. If it requires you to invest more in something, do it. If it requires you to invest less because you're going to leverage an existing support, leverage that and find ways. And sometimes government can offer you an opportunity to leverage something, another partner may leverage something. That way you spend your resources carefully on where there is nothing to work with. So I would just say that in terms of closing. Yeah.
Thank you, Rita. Yeah, I love that point about really identifying these binding constraints that might exist in the future after a program and spending resources carefully on those specifically. Marcus, any thoughts on really important research directions?
Yes, thank you. So I think we have a tool, right, that's demonstrated its value in a range of settings, and we're learning more and more about it. And as we learn more about it, this is a tool, a type of program that governments across the world are increasingly adopting. And they're doing so in sort of an increasingly fiscally constrained space. So I think one big question is, the cost effectiveness at scale and how to get there. And that is perhaps, has elements of optimizing bundles. It has elements of delivery models for scale, for effectiveness, but it also links to some of the systems thinking, right? So whether these programs, or how to embed these programs in existing systems, how to link to existing programs. So that's number one, cost effectiveness at scale. The second one, which we've touched upon a little bit as well, I think, is implementation quality and the link between quality and impact. So would love to see more work in that area. And these are both kind of active areas of investigation for us in the PEI Impact Collaborative. And I know that many others in the room are also doing really important and really exciting work in this space. So I'm very excited to learn from you all and to watch this space. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcus. And Lena, I know we heard from you a little bit earlier about research priorities, but if you have 1 minute more of any thoughts on this, would love to hear any final thinking from you, and then I'll wrap us up.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I've learned a lot today about the design opportunities and that it can actually work. You know, I think we have thought a little bit traditionally about it has to have all the components. So I think more research on different types of graduation programming would absolutely, in refugee, in displacement settings, would be really useful for us to think about that there are many different models. And then I would just like to add one more important comment to this last conversation, which is about the design. Design has to happen with the populations that we're working with, right? Because if we don't design together from the onset and communicate properly what we're trying to do, it has much less chances of succeeding, I think. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. Then scale and inclusion, research on how to scale and ensure inclusion is definitely on the top of my list. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for this fascinating discussion, and a big thanks to those who posted questions and thoughts in the chat. I see that it's been quite active. We're going to now move into a quick poll. If we could have all the participants please respond. I think that'll come up in just a second. And I'll read this out loud in case anyone needs it interpreted. Would you use ideas and materials from this session for your future work in this area? The options are strongly agree, agree, don't know, disagree, or strongly disagree. Thank you for filling this out. Okay, oh, and I'm sorry, I missed our second question, but we've ended the poll. Thank you so much for responding. I'm going to go ahead and just close us with a summary of kind of what the themes that I picked up during today's discussion. So the first thing I'll say is a statement that is so true, it's almost meaningless, which is context matters. I think what we've done today is go a couple levels down from that statement to think really about which elements of context matter and how an implementer or a funder or a government should be thinking about context and its implications for what the program can and should look like in that particular context. So we've touched on mobility and access to mobility, access to the ability to access other opportunities, economic opportunities in other places. We've also talked about challenges related to collecting data on participants who are mobile and in fragile and conflict or shock affected areas. We've also talked about the policy environment and the market environment as being really important elements of context that will affect how a program works and what is needed for a population to achieve improvements in their well-being, resilience, and overall inclusion. We know, and I think Marcus highlighted this in his final thoughts, these programs do work, right? We have many examples from many different studies and contexts and implementation models that are promising and exciting. And the big question is, how do we do more of these in a way that is going to make sense for individual groups of populations in particular contexts? So some things that came out from today's discussion were start with a theory of change, start by identifying barriers and binding constraints, and think about how to address those barriers and constraints such that the theory of change you're going for is going to work for the population you're serving. And Lena highlighted this really important point at the very end of working with the target population, not just sitting in a desk and thinking about it, but actually getting out to see how do people conceptualize these programs and the constraints that they're facing. And then the last thing I'll highlight is we talked a lot about the importance of enabling adaptation and learning throughout the course of a program. And what I loved today is that we didn't stop there. We also said you need good data, you need good monitoring, and you need the space and time to use that data and monitoring information to make decisions to inform the next cohort. So really, thank you a lot to everyone who joined the 19th PEI Open House of the season. And we all look forward to seeing you in upcoming events. So stay tuned for more from everyone in this group. Thank you again.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.